Welcome to Game Design Hour, the podcast where I interview the people behind the video games you love. I'm your host, Miles Goldsmith, and on today's episode, I'm interviewing Chris Ellis. He's one of the co-founders of the game Assimilate. It's a 1950s social deduction party game. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know about today's sponsor, Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs, or you can go and check out their website, hoffmanswoodstuffs.net, by using the link in the description. Let's get into the interview.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going good. How are you doing?
Doing well, Miles.
When did you first realize you wanted to create video games?
I've enjoyed video games since I was a child, and I think I've got two co-founders who work on the game with me, and I think all three of us kind of have that same experience. But it wasn't until the pandemic when we found ourselves. None of us are game devs by trade, so this was are in the industry at all. So it wasn't until the pandemic when we had newfound time on our hands, to say the least, that we decided to use that time to pursue game development. So I guess the short answer is that at some point before the pandemic, we realized we wanted to do it. I think it's something we always thought would be fun, but never accessible. But the pandemic is when it became a reality.
So after deciding you wanted to create video games, how did you first get into the industry?
Well, I mean, we kind of just took a stab at it, right? So the three of us, as I mentioned before, had never worked in video games before. We all agreed that it would be a fun project to do with our newfound free time, because we all have come from like different backgrounds. One of my team members is the artist, art design. So he kind of knew how to make things look nice. My other friend's a developer. He knows how to program. And I am the game designer. I've never made a game before, but I know what fun games are like. So the three of us, despite not knowing what we were doing, all kind of took it upon ourselves to learn. And that's how we did it. Like we didn't attend any meetings or anything. Like at the beginning of COVID during shutdown orders, there was nothing to do but read a lot, watch some YouTube videos. And so we decided the best way to learn is to do. So we just started making the game.
How did the idea for Assimilate originate?
That would be probably mostly me, but with some of my co-founder as well, Brett. We're also big board game fans. And so there was a board game that we played that we really liked, but we realized there could be some fun and elements added to the game's experience if you were able to do a little bit more of the hand-holding part, so to speak. And like if you were to take the board game concept, move it to a video game, and you could do a little bit more with it. So I guess it was inspired by a board game that we then combined with a couple more board games, and we mushed them together to create what came to be Assimilate. Came from essentially board games that we really like, and trying to make a video game version that we thought would be unique and different and fun.
What were those board games, and were there any other interesting things that inspired pieces of Assimilate?
So I think Chameleon was the first game that like inspired it. And so if you've ever played Chameleon, we see comments from people like, "Oh, this is a lot like Chameleon," and quite frankly, we think that's exciting that people see the connection, because it is definitely similar in the sense that some of the core mechanics work very similarly. But the other board game that I really like is Secret Hitler, or it's like it got a mafia style social deduction element to it as well, where you have people in your team that you can trust, people that you don't trust. And we felt like I think the aha moment to us came like, it would be cool if in game of Chameleon, the chameleon had an ally essentially. Mm-hmm. But it would be hard to orchestrate in a board game scenario without people closing their eyes, opening it, closing them, opening it multiple times within a session. So that's where we're like, okay, well, maybe if you used your phone and you could have the phone tell that kind of stuff. It was like essentially a combination between like the rules in Secret Hitler with like the mechanisms from Chameleon, or kind of how Assimilate came to be.
How long did you just have the idea of Assimilate in your head, thinking about it, before you really took the first steps into creating the game?
It wasn't too terribly long, and that's why I say Brett was heavily involved with the ideation and part of it as well, because I would use my friend Brett's the artist for the game. I would spitball with him like, oh man, like what if you could do XYZ? You're like, oh, wouldn't it be fun if in this board game you could do that? And so him and I collectively molded Assimilate to where it is, and we probably started talking about it as soon as November, December. And then started working on Assimilate March the next year. So it was probably only 3, 4, maybe 5 months that we were talking about it before actually doing it.
A lot of newer game devs, when trying to think of a game and get it made, don't really know where to start. What was the first step you took in creating Assimilate?
That's a great question. And like, we don't know if we know what we're doing, right? We're all amateur game devs that are just trying to wing it. I remember doing some Googling about all that kind of stuff, but like, I remember one night in particular, I had like obsessed with like thinking about the rules, and I thought it would be important to write down the rules of the game and like get people's buy-in on it. And everyone online says like the best way to do it, and you've maybe heard the term, is just to like prototype it, right? Whether it be with like sticky notes and like, getting people in a room together to like with pieces of cardboard and markers, like nothing pretty, but just like a basic, almost like a board game version of your video game. And in our case, I remember having an epiphany one moment because my day job is primarily working in spreadsheets. And I'm like, you know what? Like, I could do a very bare bones, simple version of this game in a spreadsheet that would get me, I think, enough information to determine A, if the game is fun, B, if it works, and C, maybe even work out some of the kinks and figure out how to make it better. And so that eureka moment, I think, maybe happened a month or two after having kind of dabbled with like spinning our wheels, essentially, not knowing what to do. And once we were able to have that prototype version in the Google spreadsheet, then things started to kind of really click. What
does a spreadsheet version of a video game even look like?
It's funny. There are people who can do some remarkable stuff with spreadsheets. I feel like I'm patting myself on the back. I can do some cool stuff, but there are people that do really impressive things with spreadsheets. But it's ultimately just like, if you take out all the prettiness of a game and you just bring it down to its core components. And if you think of Assimilate as well, like Assimilate's got different roles. We have different tabs for each character. So each player plays on their own respective tab. And then you're just given pieces of information. And we can do that using a spreadsheet very quickly, very easily with a few formulas. And then once it's obviously from the user's perspective, the interface is very different from what they'll end up seeing, but the experience is very similar. Mm-hmm. And you still get the glimpses of what the real game will be like. Minus all the art, fanfare, music, all that fun stuff. But like, when it comes to like truly understanding, like, I feel like the spreadsheet's a very effective way of getting a prototype version of your game out there. In fact, it's one that I challenge myself to do more often than not when I think of a game that could be spreadsheetable, if you will. Mm-hmm. And so the most recent example would be Wordle. Like, everyone's seen the huge success of Wordle pop off. I'm like, okay, could you make Wordle in a spreadsheet? And if so, how long would it take? And what would that look like? And sure enough, in less than an hour, I have like a decent Wordle knockoff that was made in a spreadsheet just to see if you can get away with doing it. And it can be done.
How many prototypes did it take from that first spreadsheet to something similar to what you have now?
So like, even the spreadsheet version, we must have had at least a dozen. Like our spreadsheet version 1, spreadsheet version 1.2, 1.3, so we might have had at least a dozen versions of our spreadsheet where we're tweaking, changing things here and there, adding additional layers or settings, if you will. But once we got past the spreadsheet phase, we had probably our alpha version of a playable demo on your phone. We've probably had at least 5 or 6 versions of that before we had our beta launch, and our beta would consistently change. So from beginning to end, we've very easily had 2 or 3 dozen versions of the game in one shape or form. So it takes a lot of shapes, take a lot of forms.
Were there any big or interesting bugs that you and the team came across while working on Assimilate?
There's a heartbreaking bug. So because we've never made a game before, we didn't know what to expect or think and all this stuff. There's a lot of nuances to it. We had our beta, our alpha and our beta, and we got all sorts of feedback and comments and things that we wanted to update and change. But I think some of like the biggest, most disappointing bugs come with when we launched our game and we did get like a Twitch streamer with a very large audience all tuning at once, and everyone's trying to join the game at the same time. It broke the game. And so it's unfortunate to learn that your game won't survive, that level of traffic all at once when you have that traffic in front of you. It's a missed opportunity in some regard. But that was definitely like the most heartbreaking bug we had, because we had a Twitch streamer wanted to play the game and ultimately couldn't. As far as like a fun or unique bugs, like especially when you get animations involved, there are things where characters either blink too much or not enough, and something crazy or funny happens with the way that they move around.
How large was the team that worked on Assimilate?
There were just 3 of us. Yeah, so I was the game designer. My friend Brett did the artwork. and Marcus did the development, the actual coding. So in addition to that, we hired like a couple of voice actors to do the narration. We hired a musician, an audio engineer to kind of work with some of the music and sound effects. So I guess total, you would argue there might be 5 of us, but only 3 working on it full time, with 2 more like freelance. So it's definitely felt like a very small team, which gives me so much respect for game devs who do the whole thing on their own. I don't know how one person can wear that many hats, because even with just 3 of us, it feels like a huge, huge task.
One of the main elements of the game is all the different passwords. How many different passwords can someone possibly get? And did you have a system for getting them, an algorithm, or did you just think of them and brainstorm different ones?
The funny thing is we had on one of the, and during that first month or 2, when I mentioned we're spinning over wheels and kind of whatever, I remember one night just saying like, I wonder how many lists I can crank out, a list of passwords. And during that night, I must have come up with 80 or so, like in just one sitting. And it took a long time, right? But I knocked out a good amount just that very, very first day. And it was just like ideas that came to me, what I think would make sense. Since then, I've probably added another 100-ish or so. So I think we've certainly, and I guess that's like a list, right? Not a password. Every list contains at least 20 words on it, 20 passwords on it. So we've got a good quite a bit in there. When it comes to like what we decided or what we talked about, we did learn from our play tests and stuff that some lists work better than others. So we ultimately did remove quite a few. Especially one of the biggest like learnings from this whole experience was with regards to the different audiences in different countries, right? Something as simple as like candy bars. I would think like candy bars are universally well loved and everybody likes candy. So if we have a candy bars list, what's not to like? But as you can imagine, certain countries don't have certain candy bars, or certain candy bars are bigger or smaller or non-existent in others. So that it was definitely an eye-opening experience, like trying to identify and hone in on a worldwide audience when coming up with ideas for new lists.
So I know that this was your first game and you don't have experience from other games outside of the pandemic, but what was it like working on a video game during the pandemic?
I mean, for me, it's the only thing I know, right? But it was definitely there were moments where I thought, it would be so fun to be working on this in person with my 2, we're all 3 of us are very close friends. So we certainly wish we were able to, but I think because we were already used to in our day jobs working remotely, we already had access to some tools and stuff that we knew worked well. Like, so we'd use Slack for communication, we'd use Google Meet for videos, and there's a particular software called Figma that's used for essentially like organizing the different assets, both the visual assets and in some cases the frameworks that we would use. And that would really help us collaborate quite a bit. So while I would say like it would certainly have been more fun, I'm sure, to do it in person, I thought it worked relatively well. I didn't feel like it inhibited us as much as you would have think.
Which parts of Assimilate did you have to put the most time and effort into to get just the way you wanted it?
I felt the balancing, right? We didn't want the robot team or the human team to win most of the time. We wanted it to get as balanced as possible. And so trying to figure out what can we do like in order to make that feel like an appropriate balance was really, really tough. Like how many rounds, what do we do anything different from round 1 to round 3? Like does the robot know who the programmer is? Does the programmer know who the robot is? Like we messed with all sorts of different iterations. We intended to like have multiple robots in the game. All these things we did to try to help make sure that the game felt balanced and we feel comfortable with like the point it got today. I think really the programmer, fine-tuning the programmer was, and like how the programmer works was a big part of it, because once we figured out that if the programmer only enters 1 clue as opposed to 3, like the human players do, then they can focus on making that 1 clue really, really good. And if that robot only gets that 1 clue, then it takes about as long for the robot and programmer to both submit their 1 as it would for a regular player to enter, a human player to enter 3. Getting that all to like work out made it so that it felt balanced, it felt fair, and from like a time perspective, even if you were all in the same room, everyone's finishing more or less at the same time. So that the balancing aspect was certainly the hardest from my perspective. I bet our developer has a different answers as far as like implementing that stuff, but on the game design process, that felt like the hardest.
In these sort of games, sometimes players feel that there's one role that's like the really fun role and all the other ones are boring. How did you balance out all the different roles to make sure every player had an enjoyable playing experience?
Yeah, so during our play testing, we had a survey. And one of the survey was, which role did you play? How did you like that role? Did you play other roles? Did you like that one more or less or the same? And I think to a degree, there's an inherent amount of some players prefer some better than others. And I don't know if there's anything that we could have necessarily done to combat that, right? But what we wanted to do is, and I think that comes back to the whole balancing point I mentioned before, we want to make it so that anybody could win, whether you're the robot or the human. Like if we felt like the humans won most of the time or all the time, then it wouldn't be fun to be a robot or programmer. At the end of it, we wanted to make sure that anybody has the possibility of winning and that there's no way to cheat as well, right? That was another tricky part because before we had it, you only had to ID the robot. You didn't have to vote for the programmer at all. And we realized through some early play tests that a player could, as the programmer, if they wanted to, just say the password as their clue. And sure, they would be outed as the programmer. But if there was no repercussions for it, then the robot would get away scot-free because they now know what the password was, So the programmer could essentially sacrifice themselves to keep the robot in the clear. And so that's where we had to make sure that we forced players to now vote for the programmer and the robot. And if the programmer gets caught, then the humans lose as well. So that goes back to the balancing part to make sure that not only is the game fair, but it's also fun because, as you can imagine, it would be very boring as a human if somebody could cheat their way to success every time.
Sorry to pop in here, but I wanted to let you know about today's sponsor, Hoffman's Woodstuffs. They specialize in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs, or you can go and check out their website, hoffmanswoodstuffs.net, by using the link in the description. Let's get back into the interview. Were there any interesting ideas that were talked about at one point or possibly in the game at one point that just ended up getting cut?
Oh, man, we have a pretty long list of stuff that we still would like to add and intend to add. As far as idea, like the one that I think I'm most jazzed about, just from like a conceptual perspective, although it will be difficult to implement, is like the idea of having different players from different languages play with each other. Right? Because our game is mostly single words, right? And so Google Translate, for instance, may not be ideal or super great at translating in sentences. Like there may be confusion or issues. But when it comes to translating a single word, it tends to be pretty effective. And so we had the thought of like, if I am Spanish speaking and I see the list of words, so my list of words appears Spanish on my screen, but then may appear English on yours, I can submit my word in Spanish on my screen and it'll show up in English on yours. And so that way we can have different players playing the same game in different languages. I still like to think that's something we can implement. It's going to be a lot of moving parts to make that work, of course. But that's the one that I just think from I haven't seen that really been done before. I think that could be really cool. My mom's a teacher. So, I just think the idea of having something that could be fun like that in a classroom, even with, students of different languages, would be really, really neat.
How many languages is Assimilate currently in?
It's in English right now. And we have plans to start localizing in other languages. But this goes back to something I mentioned a little bit before. It's not enough to just translate the game. We also have to make sure all of our lists are localized to the region as well. And that's been the harder part. So though we've made some progress on like getting the actual translations, the words translated, getting the localized list is proven to be the little bit trickier part that we're still working on. So while we're working on the technical side of actually implementing the language change, getting the game ready for that change is in the works.
How did the scope of Assimilate change from your first idea to what you currently have?
I feel like that's one thing that both of my partners are good at, like keeping me in check, because I'm the one that obviously I ideated the game and I have all these aspirations and exciting like suggestions on how I like to see things play out. The two of them, I think, are good at being what's like reasonable, what makes sense, what's going to be the best bang for our buck, so to speak. So I know one of the little things that I know I wanted to add was the ability to choose your avatar. Right. In the game, we have 12 different characters, and you get randomly assigned one of the 10 or 12 when the game starts, I would like for you to be able to choose. I think that's a fun little thing. And like, that's an example of something that got cut before we launched, because it just, we did have a version where you could choose, but it was buggy and wasn't worth a bad experience for something that didn't add as much value to the game as a whole. And so that's the kind of stuff that my two partners did a good job of, like being like, do we need it? Can we do it without? Do we need it? Can we do it without? And so for the most part, I'd say the game that we set out to make is the game we released. There were very few like sacrifices as far as things we really knew we wanted to include. Like everything we knew we wanted, we kept, but there were a few nice to haves that haven't been added yet. So we have that on our list to add in the near future.
What game engine did you use to create Assimilate?
Yeah, we used Unity. We used Unity game engine. And because my developer does program in C#, he does, even before game or Assimilate, he was coding in C# and Unity used the C#. It was a natural fit and it's been really good. I mean, like, he seems to like it a lot. So though I can't speak a lot on the tech side of things, I do know he's really enjoyed Unity and it worked really well for us.
How long have you and the team been working on Assimilate?
Well, we started in March 2020. So from March 2020, we launched it in August 2021. So it took us about 15, 16-ish months, however long that is. About a year and a half, I'd say, from ideation. I mean, I guess, as I mentioned before, ideation was maybe a little bit sooner. But from the moment we all decided to start working on it till the moment we launched, it was about a year and a half.
What was the biggest design challenge that you faced while working on Assimilate?
I think that would go back to balancing again. I know it may sound like a cop-out, but like making sure that we, even like knowing how many players we can accommodate is another thing. And that's where I think we might have, in hindsight, made a mistake, right? Like our game starts at 5 players and we were like, it's a party game. It's going to require multiple people. We have 3 different roles. And like, you can't have 3 different roles in a 3-player game, you know? So like we need to start with more players. But in hindsight, I do think that we might have made a mistake by maybe not having an alternate version of the same game with 2 roles as opposed to 1 or something. Like, yeah, because starting with 5 players, we've noticed and we've gotten a lot of feedback. It's just hard to organize a group of 5 players sometimes. And so if we can make the game a little bit more accessible by allowing fewer players, that would be a good place to start. And so figuring out how many players we could accommodate, how the different roles fit into all that, and ultimately balancing it was definitely the biggest design challenge that we faced.
Do you plan to add more content in the future? If so, what sort of content do you plan to add to the game?
Absolutely, we do. We all, the easiest thing to update going forward is like changing lists out. We do keep track of how often lists are, like passwords in particular within lists, are correctly guessed and ID'd and stuff, like based off the numbers or the win rates, right? So we can identify like how often the robot team wins based off certain lists and stuff. And the idea behind keeping track of that is because we want to make sure the game stays essentially balanced. And so if we find that there's a list category or a password in particular that the robots are consistently winning or losing, for that matter, we want to make sure we either get rid of it or change it in such a way so that's a little bit more balanced. Adding or updating lists are certainly a new feature that we want to be adding. As I mentioned before, selecting your avatar, maybe having different avatars. We did both a Halloween and like a winter update. So there's talks about having like different, like just seasonal updates in the future as well. In addition to just, like, I think some overall gameplay improvements, we want to be able to, at the end of the game, like review like what other characters did earlier, how they voted before, what clues they entered in previous rounds. Maybe even just keeping track, like having a way for players to keep track of that on their own in the game. That's something we're toying around with, because what's hard to remember as well, like going in the spirit of balance, we've gotten a lot of feedback. We're like, oh, you should be able to see what the players did in round 1. And while I agree as a human, that would be great, as a robot, that's terrifying, right? Because let's say you hypothetically submitted a bad word in round 1. If there is a record of it that stays with you for the rest of the game, there's no getting away from your blunder, right? And it is very possible, and it happens routinely, where a programmer gets a less than great clue and the robot kind of outs themselves, but for either because of good bluffing or maybe because someone else caused a diversion or distraction or what have you. There could be a number of reasons where the robot got away with it, right? And we're not entirely convinced that we want to get rid of that possibility by allowing players to see earlier rounds. So that's a good example of whether or not we want to make changes for the game that could affect the balance that we're, so highly seeking. But one of the learnings or takeaways we've had from this experience was, when in doubt, make it a setting, right? So if we're not sure if people are going to like it, make a setting. So one of the most recent updates we just launched a few weeks ago, we did give the players the option to just get rid of the round 2 word submissions, where you submit your own. So people would rather just use our user or player or game generated lists than the player generated lists. So we decided to make that a feature, and instead of trying to nitpick about how long, that's another one I almost forgot about, triggering your earlier questions about things that took a while to figure out, how long it took to design the game from a timing perspective. How long do we spend on each round? That was also something that was painstaking. And while we ultimately, came down with what we would recommend as sort of default game time state, we did realize that, okay, by allowing the players to change it, we're not going to annoy anybody. Like, we have our suggested gameplay lengths for the timers, but if you want more, because there are some players that take longer, then by all means, feel free to increase those timers. If you want to make it quicker and more fast-paced, you're welcome to do that as well. So that's one of the lessons we learned on this process, is like, when in doubt, make it a setting so that players can change it if they'd like.
Looking back now, what do you wish you could have done differently before the initial launch?
While we all really thoroughly enjoyed grading the game, I in particular love the playtesting aspect. I love seeing people play the game for the first time, the questions they ask. I get a lot of fulfillment and joy from watching people play it on Twitch. So I just think it's exciting and fun to see people play the game that we work so hard on. One thing I think that where I dropped the ball, was not promoting the game enough before we launched it. I think we probably waited too late to start that part of it. Whereas if we started sooner, it's very likely or very possible that we could have, maybe accumulated a little bit larger audience before we launched the game. Because though your game is not limited to how it performed at its launch, your launch is your best chance of finding an audience. And so you'd certainly want to have as many ducks in a row when you launch your game as possible. And that takes time. So making sure that, as fun as it is to design the game, you also have to work on the audience building part of it as well.
What was the biggest lesson that you learned from working on Assimilate?
Oh, man, that's a great question, too. I think as we talk about working on our second game, because we are working on a second game, we did have that conversation. Like, what are the main takeaways and lessons? One of the ones I've already alluded to before, that's just a very obvious, very easy lesson to reference, is number of players. We want to make sure that this game is available for a smaller player count, whether it be 2 or 3, versus starting with 5. That's a must-have for our next game. We also realized that despite having a tutorial video explaining how to play the game, we had a lot of confusion from players who play it, because we learned people don't often watch the tutorial video, right? So while we thought, or essentially assumed, having a really strong and a strong enough tutorial video will explain any gaps in knowledge of how the game is to be played, one of the learnings was that that's not necessarily the case. You can have the best tutorial video in the world, but if they don't watch it, it won't help. So making sure that our game has built-in mechanics to teach you along the way, and also trying to make it as simple as possible, right? I think starting our first game with a game with 3 different roles is tricky, because you essentially have 3 different versions of the rules, 3 different versions of how to play the game depending on which role you get. Having 3 roles might be a little much for a first game, because it just makes it a little bit harder to kind of get the gameplay across to the new players.
What would be your biggest piece of advice to a newer game dev trying to get their first game made? Start
getting people to play it as soon as possible. I know that I mentioned the spreadsheet version. The spreadsheet version, I was excited to get people to start playing. And I would certainly get all my friends and family, anybody I could who was interested in playing the game in its spreadsheet mode. I was really eager to do, because I knew I wanted to get that early feedback. But it really is the most important thing. Like, once people start playing your game, you'll start to figure out what's working, what's not working. It'll click. You might learn that the game that you had in your head that seems so cool and compelling and fun, and you have an early version of it, they're not responding to it. Why are they not responding to it? Maybe the game needs a little bit of work, or you need to change something. Maybe it's not what you thought maybe in your head it works differently than what it does in actuality, right? So getting the prototype version out there as soon as possible is super important, because even though I was eager and excited to get the spreadsheet version out and get people to start playing that, when it comes to releasing it to the public, I was so reluctant to do an alpha test. Mm-hmm. And this is when we had the actual working version that looked similar to what you see in the launch today. I was so reluctant because I knew there were issues with it. It didn't look like I wanted it to look. There was all sorts of like player mechanics that we knew we were going to change. But both of my founders were like, you know what? We're going to figure out what works and what doesn't. We're going to be able to prioritize what we should change next based off of people's responses to the game. So as soon as you possibly can, if you have a fun idea for a game, A, build it, just start building it. And then B, get people to play it as soon as possible. Because the sooner they start playing it, then the sooner you'll realize what's working.
What's next for you? What are you working on now?
So we haven't announced the name or anything of our next game, but we are working on another party game. This one we're really excited about. We're actually going to be having an announcement here relatively soon to talk about it in more detail. But we do have a new party game. It's going to be in the trivia genre. So we're going to have a trivia party game. It's going to have a fun twist. It's going to be very, very different and unique from any trivia game that we've seen out there. We've done quite a bit of research on the trivia game market. So we're really excited about it. I think it's a fun opportunity. We made the first game in 1.5 years. I think we're going to challenge ourselves to make the second game a little bit quicker. And now that we know what we're doing, I think it's very feasible. Now that we think we know what we're doing, now that we definitely know more than we did before game one. We've got a pretty fun little project that we're working on, and we're excited to share here soon.
Thank you so much for your time.
No, of course. Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Miles.
And that's how the interview went down. I want to thank you so much for listening to today's episode. It was a ton of fun to make. If you're interested in Assimilate, you can go and check it out on Steam. If you want to keep up to date with what's going on with Game Design Hour, make sure to follow us on Instagram, TikTok, or Twitter at Game Design Hour. Today's sponsor, Hoffman's Woodstuff, specializes in the design and fabrication of custom furniture made from reclaimed or sustainably sourced hardwoods. They also make custom goods and gifts for any occasion. You can find them on Instagram at Hoffman's Woodstuffs, or you can go and check out their website, hoffmanswoodstuffs.net. There's a link in the description. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope I can see you next time.